Okay, we are now live. So, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to our very first broadcast. So this is a webinar where we are going to discuss IT-related content. So to give you a bit of background, hi, I'm Sam. We're going to talk about AmalAfrica, which is a social enterprise that's been set up in Sudan to help young people get into IT. There's hundreds of thousands of graduates leaving university, and because of the economic situation in Sudan, they're finding it very, very difficult to leave the country and or get guidance on how to succeed being an engineer. So we've set up this company to help create a bootcamp, and these webinars are an attempt to get more people involved, because we had over 900 applications in the space of 2 weeks and we can't accept them all. So to help them, we're going to create these webinars where we're going to get speakers from all over the world come and share their knowledge with the young people in Sudan, and hopefully be beneficial. So to kick us off, Richard has been kind enough to be the very first speaker in our series, and he'll be talking to us about RESTful services and API requests and HTTP, and basically the building blocks of the web as we know it. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Richard, and for those of you who are on the call, you can use the group chat to ask any questions, and because Richard is on mute, so he can't hear you, and I'll facilitate the conversation. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Just let me know if you see my screen there. Are we live?
We are live. I can see you.
Excellent. Okay, I'll start now. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining me. Welcome. My name is Richard Dalton. I'm an instructor with Code Institute here in Dublin, and delighted to be involved with Sam kicking this series of webinars off. What I'm going to talk about today is just a really very narrow and fundamental piece of the web, which is the HTTP request. And the HTTP protocol really works on the basis of requests and responses. And I'm actually going to focus more on the request than the response. And I'm going to also talk about forms, really because forms are just a very, very handy way of explaining how requests work and seeing them in action. So we'll get started. What I'm going to cover in the next about 30 to 40 minutes. First of all, we're going to just talk very, very briefly about what we mean by request and response in terms of the architecture of a computer system. Not going to go into any huge detail there, and we're not going to cover any ground that would be too ambitious for beginners. So with no experience whatsoever, you'll be able to get something out of this talk. We'll look then specifically at HTTP, which is an example of a request response protocol. And we'll look at what a HTTP request is. And then we'll look at the two most common kinds of HTTP requests, a GET request and a POST request. And if you've ever used a web browser, you've done both of these, maybe without realizing it. If you've ever clicked on a link or typed an address into a browser bar, you've done a GET request. If you've ever filled in a form, chances are you've done a POST. So that we're going to talk about both of those and what they mean when you use one or the other as a developer, what the implications are. And then we're going to look at forms, HTML forms, and these are, a fundamental part of HTML. They've been around since the beginning of the web. They are absolutely fundamental to submitting data to servers. The types of web apps we're building have changed a little bit in recent years to a more rich client kind of experience. And so the traditional form of clicking a button and seeing the whole page reload has become less prominent. But actually the mechanics of what goes on when you fill in a form and submit it, and the way a form is processed on the back end is still fundamental. And before you get into frameworks like Vue or React or Angular or anything to do with Ajax, you really need to understand how forms work and how they interact with the server using GET and POST requests. And then I'm very briefly at the end going to just flick to the back end and look at a tiny bit of Python code that receives a form and takes the data out of the form. So you can see what a piece of back-end code using a framework, a web framework, actually looks like. We're going to use the Flask framework, which is one of the simpler Python frameworks. But what we're doing here works in Ruby on Rails. It would work using PHP or any web framework, C#, Java. The principles here really are what's important. So let's make a start. What do we mean by a request and response? So this is not just a web thing. This is all computer systems. We have client servers, and we have various ways for clients and servers to interact. And when we talk about request and response, what we mean is that the client sends a request to the server. So it initiates a conversation, and the server has to send a response. And there are two ways that that conversation can play out. It can be synchronous, which means the client will sit there waiting until the server either responds or times out. Or it can be asynchronous, and what that means is that the client will make a call to the server, and it will give it a means of calling back when it's ready. So you can have very long-running tasks on the server that eventually come back, hopefully, to the client with a response. And whatever arrangement you have, whatever type of conversation you have between a client and a server, you have to have an agreed protocol. They have to have a language that they can use that's common to talk to each other. And the protocol really that's dominant on the web is HTTP. It's not the only type of protocol for clients and servers to talk to each other by a long ways, but in terms of what we're doing in terms of web development, HTTP is where it's at. So let's take a look just at what we mean by that. And I'm not going to give you the comprehensive overview of the HTTP protocol. I'm giving you just enough here really to follow what's going on for the rest of this talk. So a few things to know about the HTTP protocol, which, as I just said there, is a way for clients and servers to talk using an agreed language, an agreed way of speaking. And the first thing is that it's completely text-based. So if you could snoop on the conversations between clients and servers on the web, you would be able to read it without any difficulty. There's no binary being sent up or down. Everything is text-based. It's based really around this idea, or the web is really based around this idea of there being resources out there on servers, and clients asking for those resources. So a resource might be something like a person's Facebook profile page. That would be a resource. Or it could be a list of cars that are available to rent, for example. Those are resources that we can ask for over the web. And then it's the server's job to respond to us with some response that we can read as a client. And so both the up conversation, the request for information or for a resource is a text-based part of the HTTP protocol, and also the response that comes back is part of the HTTP protocol. So the client can understand the server, and the server can understand the client. The other thing that we have to think about when we're talking about these resources, these HTTP messages that go up and down between the client and the server, is there is more than just the resource. There's what we want to do with the resource. So for example, if I have a list of contacts in a web-based application, I might ask for that list from the server, and the server will return me a list. But equally, I can send a contact to the server and ask it to add that contact to the list so that other people using the app can see that contact, or so that I can log back into the app in the future. So there's a difference there between what we would call getting information from the server or posting information to the server. In simple terms, we have read access and we have write access. And obviously the write access is a much more serious endeavor, because it affects the data that's on the server. It affects what other people see and so on. Whereas when we query the database, it's read-only. It doesn't really have serious repercussions for the back end, apart from using up clock cycles and memory and so on. The next thing is how we actually identify these resources, which I have here as URL, or unique resource locator, or universal resource locator. And you'll sometimes see this called URI as well, unique or universal resource identifier. So this is basically how we tell the server which specific resource we're interested in. And you do this all the time. If you visit a website, a website like Flickr, and you might have /photos/ 123 being the ID of a photograph or whatever, you're uniquely identifying a resource that you're interested in. And the combination of the URL and the method and the headers and the body of the message that's being sent up gives us huge flexibility in terms of building applications. So the HTTP really started off, and HTML started off as a way of just having documents on the web that we could query and click on links to get other related documents. And occasionally we could fill in a form to send some information, add a comment, or log into a website. But it has really just evolved into something that is now a platform for real rich applications. And it hasn't massively changed as a protocol. So all of this new functionality has been built on through very clever use of essentially the same basic tools that have been there since the start of the protocol, which is really impressive. So let's take a look, let's drill in on the simpler of the two. Let's forget about the post request for 1 second and just look at what happens when we do a GET request. And like I've said, if you've ever typed your URLs into a website or clicked on a link, you have done a GET request for some information. So the first part we have to think about is the URL. And I'm going to just pop out of my slides here for 1 second into a browser. And I'm actually just going to do a quick GET request just so you see what happens and what a URL actually looks like. So let's open up the browser here, and let's just go to a website like example.com, which is just a domain that we can use for testing software. It literally does nothing. But I've just typed in this URL, and I've been given this, this page back. What actually goes on, if I go into DevTools here and take a look, if I click on the network tab, and I'll just hit that URL again, I can see here some interesting information over here. The URL that I visited, the method that I used was GET, which makes sense. That's what I'm interested in. And my response came back with some information, like, for example, how long this page can be cached, quite a long time. It comes back with information about the type of content that's in the document. There are some negotiations that can happen here between the client and the server about the types of content that the client will accept, and then the server hopefully can pick from what it will accept to give it something reasonable. So this is really this HTTP protocol in action here. This is this negotiation that's going on between the client and the server. And these are headers. There's no body to this GET message. There's just these headers that go along with the URL that contain information that the client wants to provide when it's asking for the resource, and that there are then response headers where the server sends information back, and accompanying headers to allow us to do interesting things with that. And when you return, for example, HTML, which is, if I look here at the page source, this is the body really of this response that's come back. The browser then knows how to turn that HTML into a web page. So that's a simple GET request. Now, beyond the URL that we just typed in there to cause that to happen, there's an optional extra little bit that I didn't have there, which is called the query string. Because sometimes when we want to do a GET request, we want to do more than just point to a resource. We maybe want to provide some extra parameters. So let's go and actually do what I just did there again, but this time let's provide some parameters. And the interesting thing about this is the server that I'm talking to doesn't need to know about these parameters. It would need to know to do something useful. But if I just say color equals yellow, for example, hit that, and I look here and I come down and look, my query string parameters, color yellow. So the server has access to this extra bit of information that I've provided when I've hit the URL. And I can use the ampersand symbol here, and I can provide more than one. So I can say size equals large, for example. And again, if I have a look, I can see that that's all available there. So this is a very, very simple example of how I can do a GET request to a server. GET requests don't have a body as such. They have the URL and they have the query string. You technically can provide a body, but we're getting into a sort of a semantic argument there, so I'm not going to go there. What's important about the GET request is that you really should only use it for read operations. You should not be trying to call a resource on the web using a GET request if you expect it to change something, like create a contact or amend something or whatever. Even though you technically could provide all the information, you just shouldn't be doing that. If you want to modify data, then you look at the next option, which is the post request. And A post request, very, very similar to a GET request. It also has a URL. It has a body where we can include in the message that we send up, we can include some data. So if we wanted to create a contact, we might provide a little piece of JSON in there or key value pairs, basically some text that the server can read, and it can then go to its database and save that information to the server, to the database. You can, in the case of a post, have query strings as well. That raises some interesting questions because you're sending some of the data through the body and some through the query string. And so it raises questions about why you would use one or the other and how the server should respond. But as long as the client and the server agree on how to deal with that, yeah, you can send information in a query string with a post. And post requests you use when you're doing write operations. So if you're creating something on the web, if you're updating, if you're deleting, then the post request is what you want. Also, if you're sending, even if it's not actually creating some change on the server, if you're sending any kind of sensitive information, then you don't want to be including that sensitive information in the URL in the way that I did. So having username and password, for example, in a GET request in the query string would be a bad idea. Having credit card numbers there would be a bad idea. Even if you were just asking for some information and providing the, like for example, to log in, you maybe aren't creating content, you're just logging in, but you don't want to be sending information in the URL if you can, it's not secure. So you would use a post request for that, even though that's technically not necessarily a write operation. Okay, so let's look at forms, HTML forms. And the reason I'm covering these really, A, because they're fairly fundamental to HTML. If you're beginning programming or beginning web development, you really need to get your head around how they work. And they also happen to be a really handy way of demoing both these GET and POST requests. So I'll give you a little bit of background here, and then we'll jump into some practical applications. So a form is just a HTML element. It's like a div or a paragraph or any of the other HTML elements you've seen. There's a form element. It's a way of wrapping controls like text boxes, buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, and so on. And there's a whole host of other ones. And when you fill in a form, quite often you'll see a submit button of the form or a save button or whatever. And clicking that button causes the form with all of its data to be bundled up into a request and sent to the server. And that's a HTTP request. And that request can be a GET or a POST. And we're going to see both now in the next few minutes. So let's take a look at just some simple examples before we get on with getting into the specifics. Let's just jump out here and look at a simple GET request. Actually, before we get to a form, let's just look at a simple website. I was typing URLs there into the address bar, but let's just look at one other example of a GET before we get to the forms, which is where we do a hyperlink in a web page. So if I open up that, here it is, and if I click, I get brought to that same thing. That's exactly the same, really, as typing the address in. I've just clicked on a link on an anchor. Okay, so GET requests either in the bar or clicking on a hyperlink, essentially the same thing. It's a GET request, and we can, of course, create hyperlinks that include query strings in them. Let's go back to our code here and take a look at a simple form example. Okay, so if you've ever used the web, you'll have seen forms, and I've got a couple of forms here that we can play with. So I'm just going to open this one up. I've actually got 3 different forms on this page. Each of them has a submit. That's this one. It will essentially submit to these fields. This one here has some radio buttons and a checkbox, and this one here has just a color picker and a date picker, just to show you some of the variety of things that HTML provides. Let's just look at this first one, and all of these are going to submit to that example.com website, because I'm only looking at the front end here. I don't care about the back end. But what we'll do is we'll bring up DevTools and see what each form actually looks like when we do a submit. Okay, so I'm going to type in here a color like yellow, and I've got this other field which is a PIN number, and if I type into that, you'll see that I get some dots. And the reason for that is that this field has been set up to be a password field, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But let's just take a look at a submit. Here it is. And if I come in here and look at the data, I see that the data is no longer in query string in the way it was before. It's in something called form data. Now, that is submitted using a post, okay? So if I do a quick toggle into that code, and I take a look at that field that I have here, that, for example, here's the password field. I've said it's typed a password. This here is the thing that told me that that form is going to send information as a post. And so it's submitted to here. Let's look again at the, let's get rid of that. Let's look again at what happens when I type this in, and I type in my PIN number, and I hit submit. If you look at the URL, there's no query string. There's no query string in here anywhere. I'm just getting form data. Now, let's make a tiny change here and make the method here get. I'm changing nothing else now, okay? So we'll save that. We will go back, and we will again type in yellow. And again, we'll type in some PIN. Everything works the same. But now if you look, I've got a query string, because the data that was in the form has been sent as a query string. And if my message, it's now not form data, it's query string. So that one little change that I made there of the method has turned this from a form that submits data in the body of the message, in the case of a post, to one that submits data in the URL. And what's the significance of that? I've already mentioned that this is obviously slightly less secure, but it has some benefits. One benefit is that I can bookmark this, or I can email this, and the person who receives it can click on it, and it is as if they're filling in the exact same form. I can't do that with a post. So there are benefits. If you're building an app, for example, that has a fairly complicated search form that allows people to search maybe for cars or pieces of art or whatever it is that they might want to buy, if you make that search form a GET request, all of the criteria of the search are stored in the URL. That means they can bookmark the results, they can email them to people, or whatever. So there are advantages, even though this is not as secure, there are definitely advantages to making read-only forms like search forms into GET. Okay, let's jump back a little bit here and look again at our post and some of these other forms that I have. This one here has radio buttons. I can choose these and it will deselect the ones I'm not choosing and select the one I click on. I have a checkbox here. Now if I submit that, for example, and I go back here and inspect, actually I'll need to submit it one more time to see it. So click on network. If I submit that and have a look, I see my form data, and you can see that the size and this available checkbox have made it through. So here's an interesting thing about checkboxes in HTML forms. If I unselect that, and I'll leave this alone, and I submit again, I don't have available as off, I just don't have it. And that's just the way checkboxes work. If they're checked, you see them and their value is on. If you don't have it selected, it's just not there in the data. That raises issues for how you process forms on the back end. Let's take another quick look. Here's a color picker, and I can pick a shade of green here and close that down. And here's a date picker, and I can pick a date, and I can submit that form. And again, these are all going as posts, but equally I could toggle that method to get, and these would all still work. And here's my color sent as the little hash code and my date. Okay, so that's the basics of sending forms over the web, just filling in a form. We'll look at it in a second, just a little bit more about coding them and some of the other properties of the form element. But that's the basic fundamental idea. And we looked there at sending a GET. And so the thing to know about sending a form using GET, first of all, is that the fields of the form are sent in the URL. I mentioned that they can be bookmarked and emailed, and I also mentioned you don't want to send sensitive information in a GET. Okay. When we talk about posts, it's kind of the opposite. First of all, the fields are sent in the body. You can't bookmark a request, a post request, or email it. The best you can do is get somebody else to fill in that form themselves. But you can use posts for sensitive information, and you should only use posts if your request is going to cause changes on the server. Okay. I'm going to stop here because we're going to look at the back end in a minute. I'm going to jump back into the code for a few seconds and just look for a little bit longer at the front end code and just look in a little bit more detail about how forms work. So forms, as I've said, they're a HTML element. We have an opening and closing tag. The method is simply get or post. The action is the URL that we want to send our form to. And then we have various controls, and we have these input controls with different types. So this is a text input, a password input, radio buttons. By setting these things to radio button and sharing the name, we got to see them in a mutually exclusive group. Checkbox, we just set the type to checkbox and give it a name. And as I said, on the back end, if you're processing a checkbox, if it's not selected, you're not going to see it in the response. HTML5 actually added some extra input types. So a lot of things that maybe in the past someone would have had to code a jQuery little pop-up screen. Now it's just basically built into HTML. So we have things like color pickers and date pickers and so on that make capturing that kind of data very easy. If I go in here and just look for 1 second at an example of a search form. So I've tried to do here not really a realistic, fully implemented piece of web development, but just a form that's a little bit more than the basic one. And so before we see it on screen, let's just look at the code and try and imagine what it's going to look like. Its action is localhost 5000 search. So we're not hitting example.com. We're actually hitting an app that's running on my machine, or will be in a second. And it's going to go to this URL/search. The method is get. So everything we fill in here, we would expect to see in the query string. Nothing is going to go in the body of any message. The first type of input that I have is a select. And it's got 4 options. These are the makes of cars. So the name of this field is make. It's got an ID here called field make. That just allows me to label it, really. The ID is not all that important. The name is going to determine how I get this data in the back end. So that, keep an eye on that. But this field is going to have 4 options. So when this pops up, we'll be able to drop down and pick one of these 4 cars. The second field I've done is just called year, and I've just done a number. But I've given it a min of 1980 and a max of 2018. So we'll have to enter a digit between, this field doesn't know that this is a year, but it knows it's 1980 and 2018. So that's our second field. I've done a text field, just a simple text field, and I've called that keywords. So we'll also see some text getting uploaded. I've done a radio button, which you saw a few seconds ago, and my 2 options there are new and used. And I've decided by default new should be the selected radio button. And finally, I've got 2 checkboxes. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive. They're not radio buttons. So I can check either or neither or both of these. So I've got a CD player as an option on these cars, or air conditioning. And then my submit button. So let's see what that looks like here. And for now, I don't actually have the back end running, so I'm just going to go back, make sure I have that running. Here's my back end. I'm going to start that up. So that's now sitting, waiting, hopefully, for this form to be submitted. Now, it doesn't matter, the back end doesn't matter too much, because first time we run it, we're just going to look here at our network tab like we did before. So let's fill something in. Let's drop this down and choose a 2016 car, red, used, and we'll check both of these and we'll hit submit. Okay. And well, we got a server error, which is interesting, but that's going to be a back-end problem. What's really interesting though too is at the moment is our query. And so this is our query string. And if you look, there's all the data and you can see it up here. We've got the make is Citroen, the year is 2016, the keyword red, the type is used, the CD player on, and the air conditioning on, and that's how checkboxes are denoted, just the word on. And of course, all of these are separated by the ampersand. So all of that information goes to the back end. Now, let's have a look at that back end and see if we can understand what's going on in the back end, and also if we can see what's happening here. Okay, so there's some code in here that seems to have a bug, and not surprisingly, it's to do with our checkboxes, because those are the troublesome ones. So I'm going to comment out some code here to do with checkboxes. We'll come back and deal with those in a second. Let's try another send and see if it works. So let's go back and submit, and of course it's not, because this is a live recording and it worked perfectly beforehand. So let's look at the error and see. CD player. Get these out of here. Let's get these out of here. Save this, restart our app, and submit this again. And that's worked better, okay? So our information has gone to the server. We'll fix those checkboxes in a second, but it's probably appropriate that they broke because they are more troublesome than the other fields. There's our query strings. Here is our app. What I've done with this app is really, really simple. I've just pulled the data out of the query strings, and Flask allows me to get at the arguments in the request in this way, request.args, and I can literally just get them by name. If you weren't using a web framework, you would have an awful lot more trouble. You'd be pulling bytes off sockets and so on, trying to do it. Web frameworks take all of that away and make it very, very simple. So I've pulled out these 4 things, and if you're using Python 3, F strings are worth a look. They're fantastic. We can just drop those variables now into this string and return it. So I'm not really returning a web page here. I'm not returning HTML. I'm just returning a little message that's confirming what was sent to the server. So let's take a look. And there's that information coming back. Okay. Let's see if we can quickly, just before we wrap up, let's see if we can get those checkboxes to work. Okay. So we will go in here, and I want a variable called CD, and I want a variable called AC, and I want those to pull out the CD player, because that's what I called this. If we jump back into the code here, I called this field CD player, and I called this one aircon. Okay, and our problem was that I didn't have a get there for CD player. If I put that back in, everything is going to work fine. So let us run that once more with the back end working fully. So all the same information, both things selected, and I should restart the app so that I get the benefit of it. 1 second. Okay, let's see if we now get all of our AC and everything else up there. And there it is. So our CD player is on and our aircon is on. What happens if we don't select one of these checkboxes? Let's turn off CD player, hit submit, and you'll see here the CD player is none as opposed to off, because it's not in the response that we're, or it's not in the request that's been sent up to the server. So as a very last thing, I'm just going to show you a little trick that we could do to give maybe a little bit more meaningful feedback. We could do something like this. Instead of just pulling the data out, we could say that the CD is equal to the string on or yes if the string CD player is in our request. We don't even have to check if it's marked as on, because if it's there, it's on. Else we will return no. We'll do the same for aircon. So we'll get yes if aircon is there. Otherwise, we will get no. Okay. Now let's restart that. Let's go back and turn both of these off, and we should get no, and no, and turn them on, and we get yes and yes. Okay. I have one other form here. If I go back to my code, bear with me while I close some windows down. I have another form here, which is a login form, and this is the last thing I'm going to show you. And this is going to be a form that submits information using a post. And again, I'm just going to show you how Flask on the back end will get the information out of a post as opposed to out of a query string. So it's a very simple form. It's a text input with a name of username and a password input with a name of password. Okay, so let's look at our back end for that. And here I have a route set up called /login. It allows me to send posts. And this one, of course, I didn't have to specify anything because get works by default. And here I pull the username out. And notice the only difference really is up here I pulled the request args, and here I pull data from the request form. And that's it. There's no other real difference, at least none really significant for this kind of example. So let's rerun this. Let's try and log in with our login page. So we'll run this. And we'll just type in a username, Richard, and I'll type in some password. Hit submit, and we can see that it's figured out what I typed in for the username and what I typed in for the password, and it's returned them. And it did that exactly the same way as before. It just pulled out those variables, used an F string, and just returned them. Obviously, I could write some code in here to go off and validate the username and password in a database, or if I had a method that was a post that received details on a car, I could save them to the database if I wanted to. So that's really where you get into the back-end development. But in terms of sending stuff from a form or from a client to a server, you've got get and post working natively in the browser because of HTML. If you look up HTTP, you'll see that there are a whole host of other verbs, delete and put and so on. To use those, you'd have to get into using JavaScript. Those are not going to work natively just using HTML. And that's really where you get into this area of building full APIs at the back end that you communicate with just through these HTTP requests. And you're moving then into the kind of world of building rich JavaScript front ends that talk to backends using HTTP requests. The availability of all these other methods and the debate about what should be in the body when you're sending up these other types of requests, that's a very, very big subject. It's beyond the scope of today. But to understand that broader scope, you really have to understand this basic stuff. And that's why I've covered that today. So that's our request. So just a quick summary of what we looked at there. We saw the back end. We sent forms. Actually, that should say to the server. Send a form from the client to the server. We handled the submitted form on the back end using Python code. Equally, you could use PHP or whatever. We saw that gets send their request through query strings, and we saw in Flask an example of how to extract those from the request. Post sends its data in the body, and we saw that it wasn't much more difficult to pull that information out. And so just in summary then for what we saw today, we saw that the HTTP protocol is a request response protocol. We looked at get and post because those are natively supported in the browser. If you're beginning to do HTML and a little bit of CSS and a little bit of JavaScript, you're going to be predominantly using get and post. And there are plenty of developers who've just stayed away from the other methods that are available under sort of the REST API type of development, and have stuck to doing everything through get and post, and that will work fine as long as you keep get for read only and you use post just for sensitive information and for write operations. You can do pretty much anything you want. You can use both get and post through forms, as we saw, simply by changing the method. And as I've said, with get requests, the params are sent in the URL, and with posts, they're sent in the body. So that's it from me. If you want to contact me, I'm on Twitter. I'm on GitHub as well. I'll post the code for this, and Sam will get the details out to you so that you can play around with the code. But thanks for watching, and enjoy the rest of the webinar series. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much, Richard. That was very, very useful. I've got a few questions here that I'm forwarding on.
Sure.
One is the API requests, the request that you're using to demonstrate get and post requests. They're not really just for HTML, right? A lot of web apps, a lot of mobile apps, right? On iOS and Android, any mobile phone, they essentially talk via get and post.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the form and the HTML is just the nice, simple way of demoing it, but it doesn't change at all. If you want to make an iOS native app talk to a web service, you're going to use exactly the same get and post. If you have just pure JavaScript running in the browser, you don't necessarily have to use form submit and have the whole page reload. It's basically the same technology that works there. Whether it's an Android app, iOS, Windows desktop apps, anything that hits a web service, anything that talks over HTTP, it's going to be using those methods. And of course, you have the possibility of using other methods if you get into REST APIs, but get and post are all you need if you really want to minimize what you need to know.
Absolutely. And the second question was about people wanting to get in touch with you after you post a code to GitHub. Are you happy with them getting in touch?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm on Twitter there, and I'll push this code to GitHub this evening and send you the details. And anyone wants to ask any questions on Twitter, or message me on Twitter, and I'll give you my email address if anyone wants to get in touch. We can do that.
Okay. I'll also invite everyone to the public Slack channel to allow the speakers and the people watching.
Yep, I'll be on there as well, so people can ask whatever they like. Yep.
Right. Thank you very much, Richard. It's been
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and it's been a really informative call. And I hope we have you again in the future.
That'll be great. Thanks for that.
Take care.
Okay, bye now. Bye.